It is our favorite time of the week again. Time for hashtag Rise and Q's when we get to answer your questions. Saagar, what is up first?
Number one, even watching Rising every day, I'm still confused about the parliamentarian. You're not the only one. I thought Kamala Harris could overrule the parliamentarian on anything, or Biden could replace them. So why are people still saying certain things depend on their approval? You're a very astute man.
Such a great question. So the parliamentarian is just literally like a paid aide to the Senate.
Correct.
Who advises on different rules. The rules of the Senate and of the House, very complex. Okay, so you do need someone who's like, it's their job to understand them, that when you have a question about like, can I do this, can I do that, you go to them. But that doesn't mean that they get to like completely overrule that, or that their ruling on something like that is ironclad and can't possibly be violated. So yes, if Democrats wanted to get a new parliamentarian, they could. If they wanted to overrule the parliamentarian, they could. It is an imaginary, made-up obstacle that they're using to keep from doing things that they don't actually really want to do.
No, that's exactly right. Remember, the Republicans fired the parliamentarian in the year 2000 for the Bush tax cuts, and they just replaced them with somebody who's like, yeah, you're good. So, I mean, look, it's basically up to them. Now, your question says Biden. It's actually not up to Biden. It's more up to Schumer and all of them, but, you know, he probably would have some influence.
Yeah, if Biden said, Schumer, you need to get this done, it would get done.
There you go.
All right, second question. I love your show and agree with nearly everything. However, as an aging boomer, Republicans hammered into my brain concern for deficits. A very self-aware question.
Yeah.
Could Saagar help me understand why that is not a big deal, or at least why it's no longer so important? All right, Saagar.
Doesn't have to be just me, but Mr. Boomer. It's actually funny. I was recently in an Uber, and the driver was like, man, the deficit's out of control. And I was like, is that something you worry about? And he's like, you know, now that you ask it that way, I've never worried about it. I've just been told to worry about it. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. And so listen, here's what it is. The deficit is something where, look, you cannot, the only restriction whenever it comes to money is you can't, there's no restriction in terms of how much your own currency you can borrow.
Right.
So then what are you worried about? You're worried about inflation. So do you have inflation or not in terms of your money supply? Now, right now, actually the day we're taping this segment, the CPI came out at 0.9% for this month. That sounds very high, but let's dig into it. What is it exactly? It's a spike in prices of used cars, up 10%. Hotels, same thing. All of the temporary spikes in prices are extreme demand for goods because the economy is reopening, not because of what people are buying in terms of prices, which will remain static across the next year. So what could we surmise from that? Which is that we borrowed or printed or whatever X trillion amount, and that the only spike in price comes from relative demand and not from the fact that there's too much supply. So in extraordinarily basic terms, that's where I think is a good real-world example of why you should not care as much about the deficit.
Yeah, and look, it is a little bit complicated. Just to make it super simple, number one, I would say Stephanie Kelton's book on modern monetary theory exposes some of the ways in which all of our brains were broken by political discourse, which would have you believe that like the government operates just like your household, and you gotta, you know, that you have to balance, and it's exactly the same.
Sovereign nations are not the same thing as your house.
Especially not when our currency is, you know, the default currency of the world, which gives you an added layer of power. But you know, and that's basically the falsehood here, is this idea that it's exactly like a budget. But just ask yourself over the course of your lifetime, how many times have you heard scaremongering about the deficit and the debt? And how many times has that ever come to fruition in terms of actually causing some sort of collapse? We just haven't seen it happen. So rest easy. It's not that there's no limit. This is one of the things that people sort of mischaracterize modern monetary theory, that you can just print money forever and there's no limit and never causes any problems. That's not the case that they're making. But what they say, as you pointed out, is that basically the limit isn't some arbitrary dollar amount of now the deficit is too big. It's about how much that money can be used productively. And once you start to see inflation, that's an indication that you're getting too far out over your skis.
That's exactly it. Which is that, I mean, think about it this way. People are like, why don't you just give everybody why don't I just give everybody a car? Well, it's like, it's not that the money about buying a car is there. It's that the supply of cars doesn't exist. So obviously that would send a spike, right? So you have to think about it in a more reasoned fashion. And I know it can sound complicated. I'm trying to keep it as basic and simple as possible, because I think that one of the ways that deficit hawks rule the conversation is by, creating these fake memes around like, whoa, the government's like your house. Or,
gotta balance your
we
checkbook.
gotta balance your checkbook. It's like, that's literally the opposite of how sovereign nations work and have worked for eternity. So there we go.
All right, last one. How long do you think Texas will be a red state given the new 2020 census data? That is actually a really interesting question, and I will hand it over to my Texan friend here in a moment. But I guess what I would say is, number one, this kind of goes back to that idea Democrats had right up until 2016 of like demographics is destiny. Because you look at the demographics of Texas and you're like, oh, obviously, this is going to be Democratic terrain. And yet election cycle after election cycle, it never seems quite to pan out. And in fact, I would say in 2020, there was a significant setback in that regard, in that you had a large percentage of Texas Latinos switching or showing up to vote for Trump or even switching their vote from Democrats to Donald Trump. So that tells you nothing about Texas turning blue is inevitable at all. That being said, it's a suburban state, growth of the suburbs, people moving into the state from other blue states do give Democrats a chance, I would say, over the next decade to start to turn Texas that way.
It's possible. I just think the Republican Party is going to change, and I think it'll probably stay Republican for quite a long time. If we're looking, I did the radar this week on some of the Catalyst exit polling data, showed exactly what you said, large swing of Latinos into the Republican Party, particularly in the state of Texas, a 9-point swing from 2016 to 2020. Massive. And I expect that probably to continue. And I do think that the Republican Party of Texas will be this strange amalgam of the Trump aesthetic along with Mitt Romney type policy. And the reason why is Houston and Dallas, the financial and petro guys who are largely culturally conservative whites, and the suburban, but they just really hated Trump. So a lot of them voted for Biden. If you keep the policy around the taxes the same, but you have a little bit more of a Trump aesthetic without Trump, such the polarizing figure himself, I see that coalition standing for a very, very long time to come, especially just the way the demographics are working. But like I said, yes, many of these people who are coming from California, New York, and elsewhere, they vote the same. But I just think the Republican Party, it's so powerful there, will adapt and change. Although there is one Democrat, possible, if he did run as a Democrat, who I think would win there, and that's Matthew McConaughey. So we'll see.
Big caveat there.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll have more for you later today.